Honey, starting with this paycheck, we're switching to separate finances. I'm sick of supporting you, my husband announced. I cheerfully agreed. And when the husband's relatives arrived, as usual, to eat for free and walked into the kitchen, they screamed at what they saw. Isabella Montenegro woke to the sound of her alarm at 6 a.m. It was still dark outside, but she liked unhurried mornings. She got up quietly so as not to wake Fernando, slipped on her robe, and went to the bathroom. Cold water washed away the last traces of sleep. She was 32, and for 8 years she had worked at a large logistics company. She'd started out as a simple coordinator and was now a senior specialist in international shipping. Her salary was $1,500, plus quarterly bonuses that sometimes reached $700. The job was stressful, full of emergencies, a container stuck in customs, paperwork filled out wrong, a supplier missing deadlines. But Isabella had a talent for quick decisions and always found a way out. In the kitchen, she turned on the coffee machine and took breakfast ingredients out of the fridge. Cooking was her way to unwind after long, hectic days. While her hands chopped vegetables or mixed dough, her mind rested from endless calls and emails. On weekends, she could spend 5 hours in the kitchen experimenting with new recipes, and it brought her real joy. Fernando came into the kitchen around 7, sleepy and tousled. He worked as a project engineer in a construction company, earning about $1,000, a solid, steady salary for their city. They had been married for 5 years, and from the start Isabella had made her position clear: no traditional roles, she wasn't going to be a housewife. Fernando had agreed without hesitation, even seemed surprised she brought it up at all. But life turned out so that Isabella ended up handling the home anyway, not because she had to, but because she liked it. Cleanliness and order calmed her, and cooking had become a true hobby. Fernando never demanded it of her, he simply took it for granted. That morning's breakfast was cottage cheese pancakes with homemade blueberry jam and freshly squeezed orange juice. Fernando ate silently, scrolling through the news on his phone. Isabella finished her coffee and looked at him. He seemed thoughtful, but she didn't ask. Everyone has their own thoughts. After breakfast, Fernando left first. He needed to be at his morning meeting by 9. Isabella stayed another half hour, washed the dishes, wiped the countertops, loaded the laundry. Everything was done automatically, quickly, without tension. The workday flew by in its usual rhythm. Their Chinese supplier had delayed a shipment of components. She had to find an alternative route through Mexico. 3 video calls, a dozen emails, coordination with the customs broker. By lunchtime, it was resolved. Her boss, Emiliano, nodded approvingly. He no longer seemed surprised by Isabella's ability to get out of the trickiest situations. In the evening, she stopped by a big supermarket not far from home. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant Fernando's relatives would be coming over. It had been a ritual for the past 3 years. It started when Fernando's brother, Valentino, had his 3rd child. Valentino was 38, his wife Serafina 34. The children had arrived one after another, 2 years apart. The boys were now 10 and 8, the little girl 4. Serafina looked exhausted, constantly busy with the kids, while Valentino was always at work. Fernando and Valentino's mother, Catalina, had then suggested gathering every Saturday at Fernando and Isabella's. Their apartment was larger, and Isabella cooked so well, let Serafina rest from the kitchen at least 1 day a week. Isabella didn't mind. She liked cooking for a crowd, seeing happy faces, hearing compliments. She filled an entire shopping cart, 2 whole chickens for roasting, a kilo of beef for roulades, fresh vegetables of 3 kinds, bunches of herbs, cream, 3 types of cheese, premium flour for homemade noodles, plus fruit, apples, pears, grapes, berries for dessert, raspberries and blueberries, chocolate for the glaze, sour cream, eggs, milk. The total at the checkout was impressive. Isabella paid by card, took the receipt, and slipped it into a special pocket in her wallet. She had a habit of saving every receipt and once a month entering all expenses into a spreadsheet, not because she was stingy, but because she liked knowing where the money went. It gave her a sense of control. At home, Fernando was already on the sofa with his laptop. Isabella carried the heavy bags into the kitchen and began unpacking. Her husband came to the doorway and glanced at the abundance on the table. Are my parents coming tomorrow? Yes. And Valentino, Serafina, and the kids. You bought a lot. There are 7 of them, plus you and me, and they usually take leftovers for the week. Fernando nodded and went back to his laptop. Isabella methodically arranged the groceries on the shelves, already planning tomorrow's cooking schedule in her head. First, roast the chicken. It would need about 2 hours in the oven. While that cooked, she'd prepare the beef roulades. Then the salads, the noodles, the dessert. Saturday started early. At 8 a.m., Isabella was already in the kitchen in her apron, cutting up chicken. She turned on some soft jazz to focus and poured herself a large cup of coffee. She stuffed the chicken with a mix of mushrooms, onions, cheese, and dill, rubbed it outside with a spiced sour cream mix, wrapped it in foil, and put it in the oven. While it roasted, she moved on to the beef, tenderizing, seasoning, topping it with fried mushrooms and onions, rolling it up, and tying it neatly with kitchen twine. Isabella worked quickly and precisely. Her hands remembered every movement. Fernando woke closer to 11. He came into the kitchen in sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt. 3 pots were already bubbling on the stove, the roulade simmered in the oven, and the table was piled with chopped vegetables for salads. The smell was mouth-watering. Need any help? You can set the table in the dining room, the clean tablecloths in the cabinet, top shelf. He obediently went to get the dishes and utensils. Isabella was whipping cream for dessert, a berry tart with custard. When the doorbell rang, she was just decorating the top with fresh raspberries. The clock showed 1 p.m. sharp. The relatives were always perfectly on time. Catalina came in first, a stout 58-year-old woman with short hair and a perpetually disapproving look. In her hand, a large bag. Isabella knew it was full of empty food containers. Then came Valentino, tall, thin, tired. Behind him Serafina, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and the 3 kids. The boys ran straight to the playroom. The little girl clung to her mother's skirt. Isabella brought the dishes to the table. Golden roasted chicken, juicy and fragrant. 3 beef roulades, sliced beautifully. Fresh vegetable salad with goat cheese. Vinaigrette. Greek salad. Homemade noodles and aromatic chicken broth with herbs. Freshly baked bread, still warm. Vegetable platters. And for dessert, a berry tart almost too beautiful to eat. Catalina circled the table, inspecting everything. Not bad. The chicken looks golden, though the roulades could have been sliced thinner. And the noodles, a bit too wide. But overall, edible. Isabella smiled silently. Her mother-in-law always had something to criticize. It was her signature style, a touch of praise, followed by a pinch of criticism. It hadn't bothered Isabella before. But today, for some reason, it stung. Lunch was noisy and long. The boys kept running from room to room. They had to be called back to the table 10 times. The girl was fussy and wouldn't eat anything except bread. The adults ate and talked about their own things. Valentino complained about problems at work. Management demanded the impossible. Deadlines were burning. The team couldn't cope. Serafina, in a half-whisper, told about yet another conflict with the preschool teacher who, in her view, didn't watch the children properly. Catalina lamented that her pension was laughable, that you couldn't live on that money, and that prices were rising every day. Fernando mostly kept quiet, occasionally throwing in a neutral comment. Isabella also sat quietly, watching. She liked seeing people enjoy her food, but today the pleasure wasn't as complete as usual. After the meal, when everyone was full and leaning back in their chairs, Catalina, as always, pulled containers out of her bag, large plastic tubs of various sizes. Methodically, she began packing the leftovers, half the chicken into one container, all 3 beef roulades into another, all the vinaigrette, half the Greek salad, the remaining noodles with broth, all the bread. Isabella silently watched as the food she'd spent 5 hours and a lot of money on was packed up and prepared to leave. It used to seem normal. Why let food go to waste? Better the relatives take it. After all, they had 3 children. It would help feed them during the week. But today, Watching her mother-in-law stuff the tubs to the brim, Isabella suddenly felt a flicker of irritation. Maybe because of the remark about the noodles, or the comment about the roulades, or maybe it had simply built up over 3 years. The relatives left around 6 in the evening. Fernando helped clear the table and load the dishwasher. Isabella wiped down the counters and put the remaining food in the fridge. There was very little left, just enough for dinner for her and Fernando. That evening, when everything was cleaned up and she could finally relax, Isabella sat down at the computer. She opened the expense spreadsheet she had been keeping for several years, a habit dating back to her student days, when money was tight and every expenditure had to be accounted for carefully. She entered the amount spent on today's groceries. Then, out of simple curiosity, she opened the tab with previous months and began reviewing the sums for the Saturday lunches. The numbers flickered before her eyes. Isabella opened the calculator and started adding. For the past year, it came to $6,000, just for Saturday lunches for Fernando's family. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. $6,000. And that didn't include their everyday groceries for the two of them, utilities, household cleaners, clothing, and gifts for relatives on birthdays and holidays. Isabella had never before calculated exactly how much she spent on Fernando's relatives. She simply bought groceries, cooked, and enjoyed the process. But now, seeing the figure in black and white, something shifted inside her. She didn't feel anger or resentment. Isabella rarely got angry. It was inefficient and draining. But there was a strange sense that the balance had been disturbed. She was investing money, time, and effort, and in return getting a comment that the noodles were too wide. Still, those were only thoughts. Isabella closed the spreadsheet, stretched, worked the stiffness from her back. She stood and went to make a light dinner for herself and Fernando, a vegetable stew with pieces of chicken left over from lunch. Fernando watched soccer in the living room. She joined him with a cup of herbal tea. The day ended as usual. Nothing special happened. The following week, Isabella noticed that Fernando had grown pensive. In the evenings he came home from work, ate in silence, then sat with his phone for a long time, frowning at whatever he was reading. Isabella didn't pay it much attention. Everyone has their own business and thoughts. On Wednesday evening, as they were having dinner, Fernando suddenly spoke. "Listen, today Augusto told me something interesting." "Augusto, who's that?" "A new colleague. He transferred to our department a month ago. Divorced. Around 40. Isabella nodded, continuing to eat her salad. "And what did he say?" "About his divorce. He says his wife, during the division of assets, won half the apartment even though she hadn't worked at all for the past 5 years. She stayed at home. And she even tried to get alimony for herself. Can you imagine? For herself, not for children. They don't have children. It happens. So he says the main problem was that they had a joint budget. All the money went into one pot, and during the divorce the court decided she had a right to half, even though he was the only one earning." Isabella looked up from her plate and at her husband. "And why is he telling you all this?" "Oh, just sharing his experience. He says if they'd had separate finances, the divorce would have been simpler. Each with their own money, no claims." "I see. He actually thinks modern couples are better off keeping separate budgets. Each person is responsible for themselves, knows how much they spend and on what. No control, no arguments." Isabella finished her salad in silence and dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Fernando, if you want to tell me something, say it directly, without these warm-ups about a colleague." "No, I'm just thinking out loud." "All right." She stood up, took her plate, and carried it to the kitchen. If he wasn't ready to speak plainly, she wouldn't drag the words out of him. Isabella didn't like guesswork and hints. If he wants to say it, he can say it. If he doesn't, that's his choice. The next day, Thursday, Fernando came home pensive again. Isabella was in the middle of making dinner, salmon baked with lemon and rosemary. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone, reading something with a furrowed brow. As she passed behind him, Isabella stole a glance at his screen. Some article about financial independence in marriage. She said nothing and kept cooking. After dinner, Fernando went to the living room. She stayed to wash the dishes. Through the interior window she could see him on the sofa with his laptop, typing something into the search bar. Isabella understood that her husband was working up to something. An idea was ripening in his head, and soon he would voice it. But she wasn't going to rush things. Let him reach his thought on his own and express it. Friday passed quietly. Isabella stayed late at work. She had to close the monthly report for headquarters. She came home around 10, tired. Fernando reheated the leftover casserole from lunch. They ate in silence in front of the TV and went to bed early. Saturday morning again began with preparations for the relatives' visit. Isabella got up at 8, drank her coffee, and went to the market for fresh fish. She decided to make baked trout. She'd long wanted to try a new recipe with a cream sauce and capers. At the market she walked the aisles choosing the freshest fish. Trout was expensive. She bought 2 kilos. She also picked up vegetables, herbs, cheese, and cream. She spent $150. At home, she began her usual magic in the kitchen. The trout needed to be cleaned, gutted, stuffed with slices of lemon and sprigs of dill. She prepared a sauce of cream, white wine, capers, and garlic, baked the fish in the oven, basting it with the sauce from time to time. She also made a meat casserole with potatoes and mushrooms, 3 kinds of salads, and homemade lemonade from fresh lemons and mint. By 1 o'clock the table was set. The relatives arrived right on time. Catalina went straight to the kitchen and sniffed the air. Smells like fish. You made trout? Yes. Expensive, I bet. Isabella didn't answer, continuing to spoon the salads into beautiful serving bowls. Her mother-in-law stood there for a while, then walked off to the living room. Lunch began as usual. Everyone ate and praised the fish. The trout really had turned out perfectly, tender, juicy, with a delicate creamy flavor. The children devoured it eagerly. Serafina asked for the recipe, and Valentino ate in silence, but it was clear he was pleased. Catalina, of course, remarked that the sauce could have been thicker and that Isabella had stuffed too much lemon inside. But that had already become tradition. Catalina couldn't live without adding her spoonful of criticism. Isabella listened, thinking how she'd spent $150 and 5 hours preparing that meal, only to be told the sauce was too thin. When everyone had finished dessert, Catalina reached into her bag for her containers. But before she began packing food, she suddenly turned to Isabella. Isabella, did you know that modern couples often switch to separate finances these days? Isabella, who was just collecting empty plates, stopped and looked at her mother-in-law attentively. Separate finances? Yes. It's when each person manages their own money. Very convenient, by the way. Convenient for whom? For both. You see, when people share one budget, conflicts often arise. One spends more, the other less, and the arguments start. But with separate budgets, each is responsible for themselves, no fights. Isabella slowly set the stack of plates back down on the table. And where did you read about that? On the internet. There are lots of articles now about financial independence in marriage. I even sent one to Fernando. He read it. Right, son? Fernando, sitting at the other end of the table, blushed and nodded. Isabella smiled faintly. Inside, everything turned very cold and clear. In an instant, she understood the whole picture. Catalina had planted the idea in Fernando's head. He'd been mulling it over, discussing it with his divorced colleague, reading articles. And now the mother-in-law had chosen to bring it up publicly, to push things forward. I see, was all Isabella said. Encouraged by her daughter-in-law's lack of resistance, Catalina went on, animated. I read a very good article. It said that joint budgets are a relic of the past. Back then women didn't work, they stayed home, so of course everything went into one pot. But now everyone works, so everyone should be financially independent. It's the modern approach, you see? Quite modern, agreed Isabella. Her mother-in-law had clearly expected more enthusiasm but decided not to stop. You work too, Isabella, and you earn well. So why don't you and Fernando give it a try? Each person spends their own money on themselves, no need to explain anything to anyone. Freedom. Isabella nodded, gathered up the plates, and carried them to the kitchen. Behind her she could hear Catalina, satisfied, starting to pack the food into containers, half the trout, all the casserole, 2 of the 3 salads, all the lemonade. The standard weekly ration for Valentino's family. The relatives left by evening. Fernando silently cleared the table. Isabella silently loaded the dishwasher. They didn't speak, each was lost in thought. When the kitchen was finally cleaned, Isabella went to the study, sat at the computer, and opened the folder with their financial documents. She took all the receipts for the past year out of the box on the shelf, spread them out in front of her, opened her banking app, downloaded all her card statements, and started calculating. Saturday lunches for Fernando's relatives, $6,000 a year, just the cost of the groceries. Regular groceries for the two of them, about $400 a month or $6,400 a year. Utilities should be split equally. Household goods, detergents, cleaning supplies, small essentials, laundry detergent, dish soap, toilet paper, soap, shampoo, around $800 a year. Clothing, Isabella dressed modestly but with quality, buying things rarely but for the long term, about $1,200 a year. Gifts for relatives, Catalina's birthday, usually cash, Valentino's, Serafina's, the three kids, plus New Year gifts for everyone, her own parents' birthdays, Women's Day for both mothers and Serafina. Around $900 a year in total. Isabella created a detailed spreadsheet, broke everything down by category, and entered the sums. Then she looked at the result. From her salary, almost everything went towards shared household expenses. Very little remained for personal needs, coffee with a friend, cosmetics, a few small treats for herself. Fernando, from his $1,000 income, contributed only about half toward the household, his share of the utilities, sometimes groceries when Isabella asked, and occasionally a major purchase like a new microwave or vacuum cleaner, maybe once a year. The rest he spent on himself, on gadgets he adored, a new phone or smartwatch every 6 months, Friday nights with friends at the bar watching football, which weren't cheap, and regular help for his mother, who constantly asked for money, for medicine, for balcony repairs, or simply because her pension had run out before the end of the month. Isabella saved the spreadsheet and closed the laptop. She stood, stretched, went to the kitchen, brewed herself a cup of mint tea, and sat by the window, watching the city lights. Separate finances. A modern approach. Everyone for themselves. An interesting idea. It would be even more interesting to see how long Fernando would last if she actually agreed to this plan. Isabella smiled faintly, sipping her tea. She wasn't angry or hurt. She simply understood that an amusing little experiment was about to begin, and that its results would be very revealing indeed. The following week, Fernando seemed even more thoughtful. Several times he looked as though he was about to say something, then changed his mind. Isabella watched him with mild curiosity, like a scientist observing a test subject about to take a decisive step. On Tuesday evening he brought up his colleague Augusto again. "You know, Augusto showed me an article today about financial independence between spouses. It made a lot of sense. It said that when people have a joint budget, one partner often starts feeling used, like one person earns and pays for the family, and the other just takes advantage." Isabella was slicing tomatoes for salad, not lifting her eyes from the cutting board. "Have we ever had that feeling?" "Well, no. But theoretically, we could." "Theoretically, a lot of things could be," said Isabella evenly. "But practically, is something wrong?" Fernando fell silent. Isabella could see that he wanted to continue but didn't know how. She didn't help him. Let him find his own words. On Wednesday he came home earlier than usual. Isabella wasn't back yet. She was stuck in a meeting with suppliers. When she arrived around 8 in the evening, Fernando was sitting on the couch with his laptop, clearly waiting for something. Isabella made a quick dinner, sautéed shrimp with garlic and served it with boiled rice. They ate in silence. Then she went to take a shower. When she came out, Fernando was still sitting on the couch, the laptop gone, just fidgeting with a cushion in his hands. "Isabella, we really need to talk." She sat down in the armchair across from him, wrapped in her robe, her hair still damp from the shower. She looked at him calmly and waited. "You see, I've been thinking a lot lately. About our life, how we live. About money too." Isabella stayed silent. "And I think maybe we should try changing something. In terms of our budget." What exactly? Fernando swallowed hard and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Isabella knew that gesture. He was nervous. I think we should switch to separate finances. It's more modern, more sensible. Each of us would be responsible for ourselves, spending our own money. It would eliminate a lot of potential conflicts. Do we have conflicts about money? No, but we could, someday. I see. So you want to switch to separate finances to prevent conflicts that don't exist yet, but theoretically might. Fernando hesitated. Well, yes. And it gives freedom. Everyone controls their own money, no need to report to anyone. Have I ever asked you to report to me? No, but then why do you need that freedom? Fernando paused, then blurted it out quickly, as if afraid he'd lose the nerve. Sweetheart, starting with this paycheck, we're switching to separate finances. I'm tired of supporting you. Silence fell. Isabella looked at her husband, her expression unchanged. Inside, there was no anger, no hurt, not even surprise, only a cold clarity. So this was it. Fernando had finally said aloud what he'd been moving toward for weeks. She smiled slowly. Fernando tensed, bracing for an explosion. Excellent idea, Isabella said calmly. What? I said, excellent idea. I fully support your proposal. Fernando blinked, stunned. His eyes widened. You agree? Absolutely. Separate finances, it's very modern and perfectly reasonable. Each person takes responsibility for themselves, spends their own money. It's fair and honest. Really? Of course. Let's start tomorrow. Why wait? Fernando sat there with his mouth open. He had clearly prepared for a scandal, tears, accusations, arguments. He'd rehearsed his lines, planned his defenses, and instead got instant, cheerful agreement. You're not against it? Why would I be? You're absolutely right. Everyone should be financially independent. Let's begin our new life tomorrow. I'm glad you brought it up. Isabella stood, leaned over, and kissed him on the cheek. Good night, darling. I have to get up early tomorrow. She went to the bedroom, leaving Fernando sitting on the couch in total confusion. He didn't know whether to be happy or worried. That reaction, he definitely hadn't expected. Isabella lay down, closed her eyes. Inside, she felt calm and cold. Fernando wanted separate finances. He would get them. In full. With all the consequences. Tomorrow a new life would begin. And it was going to be a very interesting one. Isabella wasn't angry. She was never the type of woman to cry or suffer quietly. She was the type who acted coldly, rationally, efficiently. And soon Fernando would understand that he had received exactly what he asked for, down to the last word. Thursday started differently than usual. Isabella woke at her normal time, 6 a.m. She got up quietly, showered, dressed in her work suit, and neatly styled her hair. Fernando was still asleep, sprawled across half the bed. In the kitchen, she turned on the coffee machine and took food from the fridge, but not the usual items for breakfast for two. Today she was cooking only for herself. She cracked 3 eggs into a bowl, whisked them with milk and a pinch of salt, poured the mixture into a hot pan. While the omelet cooked, she sliced an avocado into thin pieces and laid them on a slice of whole grain toast. On top, she added smoked salmon, the expensive kind she had bought last night on her way home. She squeezed juice from half a grapefruit. She sat at the table with her plate, a cup of coffee, and her tablet. Checked her work email, replied to a couple of urgent messages. Ate slowly, savoring each bite. The avocado was perfectly ripe, the salmon melted in her mouth. Fernando came down to the kitchen around 7. He stopped in the doorway, looking at the table, 1 plate, 1 cup. Good morning. Morning, Isabella replied, without looking up from the screen. Fernando walked over, sat across from her, glanced at her breakfast, then at the empty space in front of him. And what about me? Isabella looked up at him calmly. You can make your own. Separate finances, remember? Separate meals. You're serious? Absolutely. You said it yourself, everyone is responsible for themselves. I cook for myself, with my own money. You cook for yourself, with yours. But that's ridiculous. Fernando opened his mouth, then closed it. He stood up, walked to the refrigerator, and swung open the door. On the shelves stood containers and various groceries. Each one was marked with a bright pink sticky note in big bold letters. Isabella. You labeled everything? Of course. Those are my groceries, bought with my money. A separate budget requires separate storage. You'll buy your own. When? Whenever you like. You can go now, if you have time. Or after work. Whatever suits you. Isabella, are you kidding me? No. I'm following the rules you set yourself last night. A separate budget means each person is responsible for themselves. Or did you mean something else? Fernando said nothing, just stared at her. Isabella calmly finished her coffee, put her tablet in her bag, stood up, and carried her dishes to the sink. She washed her plate, cup, and fork, dried them thoroughly, and put them away. Have a nice day, she said lightly over her shoulder, and left the kitchen. Fernando stood alone in the middle of the room. He opened the fridge again, looked hopelessly at the stickers, then took out a bottle of water. It didn't have a label. He poured himself a glass, drank it in one gulp, grabbed his jacket, and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. Isabella heard the door slam as she sat in her car in the parking lot. She smirked, started the engine, and drove to work. The workday went by in its usual rhythm. There weren't many problems, and those that appeared were quickly resolved. At lunch, Isabella went to a nice cafe near the office, ordered a tiger prawn salad and a glass of white wine. She spent a fair bit, but didn't regret it for a second. The food was excellent. After lunch, she opened her banking app, created a new savings account, and named it Emergency Fund. She transferred $500 there, a third of her salary. That would be her personal safety cushion, just in case. Fernando didn't know about this account, and he didn't need to. After all, it was a separate budget. That evening, Isabella stopped by a large supermarket. She grabbed a cart and walked leisurely through the aisles, picking out groceries, but not the usual family ones. Today, she was buying only what she liked. King prawns, Fernando hated them, said they were rubbery. Avocados, 5 perfect, ripe ones. Fernando called avocado tasteless grass and refused to eat it. Blue cheese, expensive French. Fernando wrinkled his nose even at the smell. Fresh Dorado fillets, beautiful and far from cheap, about 300 grams. A bunch of green asparagus. Fresh raspberries and blueberries, small packages of each, pricey as well. Belgian chocolate bars, 3 varieties. A good bottle of white wine. Her favorite brand of coffee capsules. High-quality cold-pressed olive oil. A wedge of Parmesan, also expensive. She also bought fresh vegetables, greens, fruit, premium yogurt, and mineral water in glass bottles. The total at checkout was substantial. Isabella paid without hesitation. They were her money. She could spend them on herself, just as agreed. At home, Fernando was already there, sitting on the couch with a dark look, staring at his phone. Isabella walked past him into the kitchen with her heavy bags. He didn't even get up to help. She began unpacking. The prawns and fish went into the freezer, on the top shelf she'd never used before. She stuck bright pink notes on the bags. Isabella. Avocados, cheese, vegetables, and berries went into the fridge, on a separate shelf, also labeled. Then she took out the chocolate, coffee capsules, and olive oil. She had bought a small cabinet with shelves at the hardware store on her way home. She assembled it right there in the kitchen, set it in the corner, and placed inside everything that didn't need refrigeration. Then she closed the little door and locked it with a tiny padlock. The key she hung on a thin chain around her neck. Fernando came into the kitchen at that moment. When he saw the cabinet with the lock, he froze, staring at it. What the hell is that supposed to be? A personal storage unit. I don't want any misunderstandings. Isabella, are you even normal? Perfectly. Did you buy yourself groceries for dinner? Fernando said nothing. He had stopped by the supermarket after work but stood there lost, not knowing what to get. In the end, he'd bought the simplest things, a pack of frozen dumplings, a loaf of bread, butter, cheap sausage, and mayonnaise. He'd spent as little as possible. Now it all sat on the bottom shelf of the fridge, pitiful and lonely. Isabella took the prawns from the freezer to defrost. While they thawed, she sliced avocado, cherry tomatoes, and lettuce, adding some arugula. She sautéed the prawns in olive oil with garlic and lemon juice, arranged them over the salad leaves, topped with the avocado and tomatoes, and drizzled everything with a dressing of olive oil, lemon juice, and mustard. She sprinkled it with grated Parmesan. Then she poured herself a glass of white wine, set the salad on a tray, put on her headphones, turned on some music, and began her dinner, savoring every bite. Fernando stood at the stove, boiling his dumplings. He dropped them into the water, stirred, and stood glowering at the pot. After 10 minutes, he scooped them out with a slotted spoon. They turned into a mushy mass, stuck together. He'd overcooked them. He dumped the mess onto a plate, drowned it in mayonnaise, grabbed a fork, and sat in the living room in front of the TV, eating silently, choking down the rubbery lumps of dough. Isabella finished her salad and washed her dishes. She left his dirty pot, spoon, and plate in the sink. Then she went to the living room with a book and settled into an armchair. Fernando looked at her, then at his empty plate, then at the dirty dishes in the sink. He got up and went to wash them, banging things around for 15 minutes, muttering under his breath. When he finished, he slumped back onto the couch, buried himself in his phone. They went to bed late, each on their own side of the bed, turned away from the other. Friday began the same way. Isabella made herself breakfast, oatmeal with berries and nuts, fresh squeezed juice, coffee. Fernando came into the kitchen, glanced at her plate, then opened the fridge. His groceries, bread, butter, sausage, sat on the bottom shelf. He spread butter on bread, added a slice of sausage, and sat down to chew the dry sandwich, washing it down with water. Isabella finished her meal, washed her dishes, and left for work. Fernando stayed behind, staring at her empty chair. At work, Isabella had her annual performance review that day. Emiliano called her into his office. They discussed her results for half an hour. The outcome was excellent. Isabella received the highest rating and a $700 bonus. She left his office pleased. $700, a good amount. She'd transfer it to her new savings account. At lunch, she went to a restaurant with her colleague Mariana. Isabella ordered a marbled beefsteak with grilled vegetables. Mariana chose seafood pasta. They talked about work and their weekend plans. "How are things at home?" Mariana asked. "Interesting," Isabella smirked. "In what sense?" Fernando suggested we switch to separate finances. I agreed. Mariana nearly choked on her pasta. "What? Separate finances?" "Yep. Since yesterday. Everyone for themselves." "And how's that going?" "Wonderful," said Isabella with a calm smile. "I cook only for myself, buy only my own groceries. He does the same. Let's see how long he lasts." Mariana laughed. "You're ruthless. I like it. How long has he been holding out?" "Second day. Yesterday he ate overcooked dumplings. This morning, a dry sandwich with cheap sausage." "And you?" "I eat shrimp, avocado, red fish, expensive cheeses. All the things I never bought before because he didn't like them." "Smart woman. Let him see what it feels like." They finished eating and had a cup of coffee each. Isabella paid for herself. It felt natural. She used to rarely allow herself expensive restaurants, always saving. Now there was nothing to save for. All her money was for herself. That evening, she stopped by the supermarket again. Bought fresh oysters. She had always wanted to try making them at home. Also picked up a French baguette, camembert, figs, and honey. The total was far from small. At home, Fernando sat on the couch, hungry and irritated. He had eaten in the company cafeteria, a greasy cutlet with pasta, tasteless and heavy. His stomach had hurt afterward. Isabella walked past him into the kitchen with her bags. He watched her but didn't move to help. She started making dinner for herself. She opened the oysters with a special knife she'd bought that day, arranged them on a platter with ice, and drizzled them with lemon juice. She sliced the baguette and toasted it lightly in the oven, laid out the camembert, figs, and honey, poured herself a glass of white wine and sat down at the kitchen table, turning on some soft music. She tasted an oyster, delicate, with the flavor of the sea. Took a sip of wine. Perfect. Fernando came into the kitchen and stopped dead at the sight, oysters on ice, cheese, wine in a glass. And he stood there hungry, with nothing in his fridge but bread and the sausage he already hated. Isabella. She looked up from her plate. Yes? Can we maybe stop this already? Stop what? Well, this whole thing. The separate finances. Let's go back to how it was. Fernando, it's been 2 days. You're the one who suggested it. You said it was modern and sensible. I didn't think you'd take it so literally. How else should I take it? You said separate finances. I agreed. Now we have separate finances. Everyone for themselves. But I didn't mean this. What did you mean then? Fernando opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no answer. He turned and walked out of the kitchen. Isabella finished her wine and oysters, washed her dishes, then went to the living room and turned on a show. Fernando sat on the couch, gloomy and hungry. After a while, he got up and went to the kitchen. She could hear him fussing around, frying something. Soon a smell of burnt oil filled the air. 20 minutes later, he came back with a plate of fried eggs that looked more like charcoal. He sat down and ate, grimacing. Saturday. Usually, it was the day Isabella got up early to start cooking for the visiting relatives. But today she woke up at 10, stayed in bed scrolling through her phone, checking social media. No rush. Fernando also woke up late, around 11. He came into the living room, stretched, yawned, and suddenly remembered. Isabella. My family's coming today. Isabella was lying on the couch with a book. Yes, I remember. You're going to cook, right? No. Fernando froze in the middle of the room. What do you mean, no? Exactly that. Separate finances. I don't cook for guests. Your relatives, your responsibility. If you want to feed them, cook yourself. Or order delivery. Isabella, you can't be serious. Why not? They're your relatives too. Before, we had a shared budget, and I used to spend our shared money feeding them. Now the budget is separate. If you want to feed your parents, use your own money. But you've always cooked. Keyword, always. That was before. Now, new rules. Your rules, by the way. Fernando grabbed his phone and ran out to the balcony. Isabella could hear snatches of the conversation. He was calling his mother, trying to cancel or at least postpone the visit. But Catalina was immovable. They had already left and would be there in an hour. He came back from the balcony, pale. They're already on their way. What do? I told you, cook or order. You still have time. Isabella, at least help me. I don't know how to cook for that many people. The internet is full of recipes. Or order ready-made food from a restaurant. They deliver within an hour. That's expensive. Cooking it yourself is cheaper. Your choice. Fernando paced around the apartment for a minute, then grabbed his jacket and bolted out the door. Isabella heard it slam, then the sound of his car starting. She calmly went back to her book. 40 minutes later, Fernando returned with enormous grocery bags, burst into the kitchen, and started frantically unloading them onto the table. Ready-made salads in plastic containers from the supermarket. Frozen pizzas, 3 of them. Breaded chicken wings, frozen. Potato wedges, also frozen. Packaged sushi rolls. Slices of cake. He cranked the oven to full heat and began shoving everything in. Pizza on one tray, wings on another, potatoes on a third. All at once. Isabella walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water, took one look at the chaos, smirked, and left. Fernando spun around like a whirlwind, opening and closing the oven, something burning, something still raw. At exactly 1 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Isabella opened the door. On the threshold stood Catalina with her empty food containers in her bag, Valentino, Serafina, and their 3 children. Catalina walked in and sniffed the air. That's odd. What's that smell? What did you cook, Isabella? Nothing, Isabella replied calmly. Hello. Come in. Catalina looked at her daughter-in-law in confusion. She walked into the living room and saw Isabella sitting back down on the couch with her book. You're reading? On a Saturday? When guests have arrived? Yes, I'm reading. It's an interesting book. Please, sit down. The relatives shuffled into the living room and sat on the sofa. The children immediately ran off to the playroom. Valentino and Serafina exchanged puzzled looks. Usually by the time they arrived, the table was already set, but today the living room was empty. Fernando burst out of the kitchen, red-faced and sweating. Just a moment. Everything's almost ready. I'm setting the table. He began carrying out plates of food. Store-bought salads still in their plastic containers. He hadn't even bothered to put them in proper dishes. Half-burnt, half-raw pizza. Chicken wings, some charred, others still frozen inside. Potato wedges clumped together into one sticky mass. Sushi rolls falling apart, rice everywhere. He arranged it all on the table. Catalina looked at the scene in horror. Son, did you make this? Well, yeah. I bought it and reheated it. And Isabella? Isabella didn't cook. The mother-in-law turned to her daughter-in-law. Why not? Isabella looked up from her book, perfectly calm. Separate finances. Remember, 3 weeks ago you were telling me how convenient that is? Fernando took your advice. Now each of us takes care of ourselves. I cook with my money, for myself. If Fernando wants to feed his guests, he cooks with his. But we're family. You're Fernando's family. He can spend on you as much as he wants, his money. I don't mind. But my money is mine. Catalina opened her mouth but couldn't find words. Valentino snorted. Serafina bit her lip to keep from smiling. Lunch began in heavy silence. Everyone sat down reluctantly. The salads were bland and oily, clearly store-bought, with low-quality mayonnaise. The pizza tasted burnt, the wings were rubbery, the potatoes cold and soggy, the sushi a mess. The children refused to eat. The youngest started crying, demanding real food, like always. Serafina tried to calm her, but the child screamed louder. Catalina sat stiff-faced, barely touching her plate. Valentino chewed in silence, grimacing. Serafina just drank water. After 20 minutes, everyone gave up pretending to eat. They just sat there in tense quiet. Usually after lunch there was dessert, tea, long conversations, but not today. Finally, Catalina lost her patience. Fernando, would you please explain to me what's going on? Fernando shifted awkwardly, moving from one foot to the other. Mom, well, Isabella and I decided to switch to separate finances. Each of us is responsible for ourselves. Why? It's modern. The right thing to do. You said so yourself. His mother flushed red. I didn't mean it like this. What did you mean then? Isabella asked, closing her book. Please, do explain. She stood, walked over to the table, and sat down on an empty chair. Catalina, 3 weeks ago you told me about separate finances, said it was convenient, modern, and fair. Fernando listened. Now we have separate finances. What's the problem? The problem is that you're mocking him, starving your husband, refusing to cook for the family. I'm not starving anyone. Fernando is an adult. He can cook, or order food, or buy it ready-made. He has money and options. But you're his wife, you have duties. A wife's duties do not include feeding her husband's relatives for free every Saturday. I work, I earn money, and I pay my share of the bills. Fernando does the same. We're equals. Or do you think we're not? Catalina turned purple. Have you always been this heartless? No. I used to cook for you gladly, because I thought we were one family. But since you suggested separate finances, it turns out we're not one family. It means everyone for themselves. Valentino suddenly laughed, short and sharp. You know what, Fernando? She's right. Valentino, their mother exclaimed. Oh, come on, Mom. Isabella's absolutely right. We've been coming here for years, eating like kings, for free. On her money, her effort. She spent hours cooking for us, and we even packed leftovers for the week. We had zero shame. Serafina nodded quietly. Valentino's right. I always felt awkward taking so much food. But you, Catalina, said it was fine, that Isabella didn't mind. I really didn't, said Isabella. Back when we had a shared budget. Now the budget's separate. The rules have changed. Catalina pressed her lips together, silent. Then she suddenly stood up, grabbed her purse. We're leaving. Alberto, let's go. She called her husband's name, though he wasn't even there, clearly too upset to think straight. Valentino and Serafina stood as well. They gathered the children and got dressed. At the door, Valentino turned back to his brother. Fernando, think about it. Isabella's not the one to blame. You started this whole nonsense with the separate budget. The door closed behind them. Fernando stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the sad remains of the meal, the dirty dishes, the closed door. Then he looked at Isabella, who had gone back to the couch, opened her book to her bookmark, and resumed reading. Isabella. Yes? Maybe we should stop this. Go back to how things were. Fernando, it's been 3 days. 3 days of the separate budget you proposed yourself. You're already giving up? I'm not giving up. I just realized this isn't right. What exactly isn't right? All of it. Separate meals, separate cooking. We're a family, we should do things together. Then why did you suggest separate finances? Fernando said nothing. You listened to your colleague Augusto, the one who said his ex-wife took half of everything in the divorce. You listened to your mother, who planted the idea of separate budgets. And you decided that I was using you, spending your money left and right. Isn't that so? Not exactly. Exactly. You thought separate finances would give you control, that you'd know I only spent my money and you'd spend yours, and everyone would be happy. But you didn't realize that separate finances mean separate lives. Everyone for themselves. In everything. Fernando sank onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. I'm an idiot. Yes, you are, said Isabella calmly. But that can be fixed. He lifted his head, looking at her hopefully. You'll forgive me? It's too soon to talk about forgiveness. First, you need to understand exactly what you've done. Isabella set down her book, stood up, and went to the kitchen. She came back with her laptop, sat beside Fernando, and opened a spreadsheet. Look, she said, here are our expenses for the past year. Everything categorized, with receipts and proof. Fernando stared at the numbers, his eyes widening with every line. Saturday lunches for your relatives, $600 a year. That's just the cost of ingredients. My time, electricity, and water aren't included. I didn't know. Here, our regular groceries for 2 people, yearly total. Utilities, household supplies, my clothing, gifts for relatives, yours and mine. Isabella showed each category one by one. Fernando said nothing, growing paler by the minute. In total, from my salary of $1,500 a month, almost everything goes to household expenses. There's barely anything left for myself. Isabella, I didn't. And you contribute about $500 from your $1,000. The rest you spend on yourself, gadgets, nights out with friends, money for your mother. Where's the fairness in that? Fernando stayed silent. Isabella closed the laptop. That's why I agreed to the separate budget, so you could finally see how much I actually put into this family and what I get in return. Comments about noodles being too wide. She stood up and set the laptop on the table. When you truly understand that, then we can talk about forgiveness. Isabella went to the bedroom and closed the door. Fernando sat on the couch, staring into nothing. His head throbbed with thoughts. He really hadn't known, hadn't counted, hadn't thought. He'd simply taken it for granted that Isabella cooked, cleaned, cared. He thought that was normal, the way things were supposed to be. But it turned out he'd just been using her, living in comfort at her expense, never paying for what she did. And on top of that, he had the nerve to think he was supporting her. That evening, he tried to make dinner, boiled pasta, opened a can of stew, mixed them together. It was inedible. He ate it, choking down every bite. Isabella came out of the bedroom and cooked herself a steak with vegetables. She ate in the kitchen, he ate in the living room. They didn't speak. Sunday passed in heavy silence. Fernando tried to clean the apartment but didn't know where to start. He vacuumed the living room, then ran out of energy. Tried to do laundry but mixed up the settings. The clothes shrank. Isabella went about her day, working on her laptop, reading, watching a show. She ignored him. In the evening, his mother called. He stepped out onto the balcony. The conversation was long and difficult. Catalina scolded, blamed, pressed. Fernando tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. When he came back inside, his face was gray. Isabella looked at him but said nothing. They went to bed on their separate sides. Fernando couldn't sleep all night, tossing and turning, thinking. Isabella slept peacefully, her conscience was clear. Monday. A new work week. Fernando left early without breakfast. He couldn't cook, and buying food at cafes every day was expensive. Isabella had oatmeal with berries, finished her coffee, and went to the office. The day was busy. More problems with the Chinese supplier, some paperwork issue, maybe something else. Isabella spent 3 hours sorting it out, calling, emailing, negotiating. By lunchtime, it was resolved. In the company cafeteria, she met a colleague from another department. They chatted about work and the weather. Isabella didn't mention what was happening at home. She didn't like sharing private matters. That evening, Fernando came home late. Isabella had already eaten pasta with seafood. He went into the kitchen and opened the fridge. His groceries, the leftover bread and sausage, still sat on the bottom shelf. Nothing else. He'd forgotten to buy more. Again. He tore off a piece of bread, chewed the dry dough, washing it down with water. Isabella sat in the living room watching a movie, not even turning her head. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday passed the same way. Fernando ate whatever he could find, cafeteria food, something from a shop on the way home, or just plain bread. He spent a fortune doing it, nearly $200 in a week. His clothes were wrinkled because he didn't know how to iron. The apartment was a mess because he didn't know how to clean properly. Dishes piled up in the sink, he washed them half-heartedly. And Isabella lived her life. She cooked delicious meals for herself, went to work, met with friends. She was doing fine. More than fine. By Friday evening, Fernando couldn't take it anymore. When he got home, Isabella was in the kitchen, cooking duck with oranges. The smell was heavenly. He sat down at the table, watching her move gracefully at the stove. Then he said quietly, "Isabella, can I talk to you?" She turned to him. "I'm listening." "Forgive me. Please. I understand now. I was wrong, selfish, I didn't appreciate you. Go on. I want things back the way they were. A shared budget, a normal life. No more of this separate nightmare." Isabella turned off the stove, wiped her hands with a towel, and sat down across from him. "All right, but there will be conditions. Anything you say. I'll continue tracking all expenses. You can check any time where the money goes. Total transparency." "Agreed. Saturday lunches for your relatives, twice a month, not every week. And we discussed them beforehand." "Agreed. No more taking food home in containers. Meals are cooked to be eaten here, not to be packed up." "Agreed. You stop taking advice from people like Augusto about our marriage. If we have problems, we discuss them together, not with outsiders." "I promise." Isabella paused, studying him. "And last, you understand now that I'm not some kept woman you support. I'm your partner, an equal partner. I contribute to this family as much as, and often more than, you do. I understand. I really do." "All right, then. We'll go back to a shared budget." Fernando jumped up, ready to hug her, but Isabella stopped him with a gesture. "Wait. I've forgiven you, but I won't forget. What you said, that you were tired of supporting me, that will stay with me forever." "Isabella, I didn't mean." "I know, but you said it. And now I'll always remember that in a critical moment, instead of standing by me, you blamed me. That's changed something between us. Forever." She stood, went back to the stove, and resumed cooking dinner, but this time for two. Fernando sat at the table, realizing that something had broken in their marriage, something important, and it was his own doing. A month had passed since that fateful conversation. Fernando really had changed. He became more attentive, more caring. He helped around the house without being asked if she needed anything, took an interest in how her day had gone. He no longer listened to Augusto's advice. In fact, he distanced himself from that colleague completely. They spoke only about work, nothing more. Catalina had changed too. She became more restrained, more polite. She came twice a month, as agreed, ate, said thank you, and left. No containers, no criticism. Outwardly, life had returned to normal. But inside, Isabella felt that something remained broken. When she looked at Fernando, she no longer saw a husband she trusted without question, but a man who could betray her, fail to support her in a hard moment, accuse her instead of defending her. She kept saving money in her separate account, a third of her salary each month. There was already more than $4,000 there. Her backup airfield. Just in case. Fernando didn't know about the account, and he wasn't supposed to. because now Isabella always kept a plan B in mind, always ready to leave if she had to. She was no longer the wife who gave herself entirely, without reservation, who believed without doubt, who thought marriage was unbreakable. Now she was a wife with her eyes open, one who saw her partner's flaws, who knew what he was capable of at his worst. And that knowledge changed everything. One evening, they were sitting on the couch watching a movie. Fernando put his arm around her shoulders. Isabella didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She sat quietly, watching the screen. "Isabella, are you happy?" he asked softly. She paused. "I don't know. I'm calm. But happy? I'm not sure. Because of what happened? Yes. Is there something I can do? You already are. You're trying, I see that. But it's not enough? Time will tell." Fernando drew her closer. Isabella let him. They finished the movie in each other's arms. But inside her there was emptiness, not coldness, not anger, just emptiness. Where there had once been unconditional love, there was now cautious affection. She didn't hate him. She simply didn't love him the way she used to. Part of that love had died the moment he said, "I'm tired of supporting you." And that part could never be brought back. No apology, no effort could revive it. Something had died irreversibly, and that was the saddest part. They went on living together, sleeping in the same bed, dining at the same table. They looked like a normal couple, but inside, everything was different. Fernando still hoped that, with time, things would return to how they were, that Isabella would look at him again with loving eyes, that the closeness they once had would return. But Isabella knew it never would. Never. She had forgiven him, but she hadn't forgotten. And she never would. Because some wounds don't heal. They scab over, they stop hurting, but the scars remain forever. And every time she looked at Fernando, she saw that scar, remembered those words, that betrayal, and kept her emotional distance. Because she could no longer trust him completely. And without trust, real intimacy cannot exist. Half a year passed. Then a year. They were still together. Lived peacefully, without fights. Fernando kept trying. Isabella kept her distance. Her savings account grew, 5,000, 6, 7. One day Fernando asked, "Isabella, will you ever truly forgive me?" She looked at him. "I forgave you that very day. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean trusting again. So you don't trust me? Not like before." "No." "Can that trust ever come back?" "I don't know. Maybe not." "Then why are we still together?" Isabella thought for a moment. "Habit, I suppose. Convenience. Divorce is complicated. But you don't love me anymore?" "I do. But not the same way. Less. Colder." Fernando lowered his head. "I ruined everything, didn't I?" "Yes." "And there's no fixing it?" "Most likely not." They sat in silence, side by side, each in their own world. Fernando realized he had lost her. Forever. Even if she was still there physically, emotionally she was gone. That was the price of his mistake. The price of his mistrust. The price of words that can't be taken back. He had earned forgiveness, but lost her love. And that loss was irreparable. Isabella went on living, working, cooking, taking care of the home. On the surface, nothing had changed. But inside, she was already free. Emotionally free from the marriage. She stayed only out of pity, out of habit, out of a wish not to hurt him. But love was gone. And someday, she would find the strength to leave. Not today, not tomorrow, but one day. Because living without love is impossible. And Isabella was not the kind of woman who endures. She never had been, and never would be.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.